Okay. Hi everyone. I'm Sid. I sort of started this independent study thinking, like, I'm gonna do this fun independent study alone. But then me and Ethan dropped out of a computer crime class together, and we needed something to do, so I was like, come do this independent study with me. You have cool ideas. And then Gabe overheard us talking about it, and Gabe was like, can I do it too? I like this stuff. And we were like, yeah. So now we've been working together for a semester. And yeah, we all kind of branched off into different directions, as you'll see through what we talk about. But I focused on some books that I was reading about exactly a year ago. That being some stuff on Holobiont theory by Scott Gilbert, and A New Philosophy of Society by Delanda, which Farah introduced to me. Thanks, Farah. So just for a brief definition, so we have some context going into this, Holobiont refers to the single unit of host plus symbiont, and anything it's in symbiosis with, as an individual unit. So rather than being two disparate things, it's a holobiont. And I'm going to try to bring assemblage theory into this, ideally. This was my slide to remind me to say thank you to people. So thanks, Megan Dobro, for advising us, and Ethan and Gabe for working with me, and other people who helped along the way, like Christoph and Ramon specifically. And this was my slide to remind me to do a disclaimer, which is that I'm not a biologist or a philosopher, but I've been reading this stuff for about a year, and I think a lot about it. So I think I have something to say. So this is Scott Gilbert. I was reading The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet, and Scott has a chapter in that where he talks about what actually makes something an individual. Is it just the organism? These are the 6 tenets by which an organism is defined as an individual. But he finds in a lot of examples, he's an evolutionary biologist. In his research, he's found a lot of ways that a lot of these don't really hold up. So the first one being anatomic individuality, and this is the claim that your body is singularly yours. But actually, only 50% of the cells in your body are yours. Those in the photo are cholera, so I don't think he's actually 50% cholera. But and not only is it large amounts, the volume of the microbes in your body is equivalent to the volume of your brain, and the metabolic activity of those microbes is that of your liver. But also they're quite diverse. So the mouth ecosystem is different to your skin, your intestines, your airways. And what we saw in the movie we screened last night is actually that the microbe ecology in the what's this called? The crux?
The crux of your arm.
The crux of my arm is more similar to any one of yours crux of your arms than from here to here on me. That's cool. The next one is genetic individuality. And he refers to the modern synthesis in biology, where Darwin's evolution was synthesized with genetics and the passing on of genes, as how that led to an emphasis on DNA as yours, the blueprint for who you are fundamentally, and that being a big marker of how you're an individual. But actually only 22,000 genes in your body are from you. They have your genome in them. But there's an additional 8 million just from bacteria. Humans receive these in the birth canal and through skin-to-skin contact while they're being born and as they're starting to grow up in the world. But a lot of arthropods just receive them packaged up like a gift from their mother. And not only this, but the genetic diversity brought from microbes has big impacts on the organisms themselves. So for example, pea aphids reproduce asexually, so they shouldn't have any diversity at all. But they're actually quite diverse, and it's purely because of the bacterial symbionts and the diversity they afford them. Developmental individuality. This is the idea that you're developing from cells to fetus to full-grown individual as an individual. But actually, bacterial cells and any of your symbionts are really critical to your development. So they induce normal gene expression in intestinal cells of mice, and it's assumed also for other mammals. Those intestinal cells can't develop properly in a germ-free environment.
Yeah, no, I've been working.
Yeah. I forgot to put a picture on this one, but that's okay. Immune individuality. So he talks really personally about this one because going through schooling to be an evolutionary biologist, he was taught that the immune system is like the barrier between you and the world. It's like the hard and fastest wall that walls you off as an individual, which in some ways it does protect you from the outside world. But it also sort of acts as more of like a negotiator between you and the outside world, allowing some things in, welcoming some things into your body that help it. And it's evolved for a long time aside those symbionts in order to know who's a friend, who's a foe, and who's okay to be a part of you. And also, immune cells don't form that microbial symbionts. Well, at least. For physiological individuality, this is the idea that all the components of your body are working together towards a common goal, and that's the goal of keeping you alive and reproducing you. But sometimes others are actually helping out. Sometimes it's not just you. And one example that Scott gives is that the milkweed bug, in order to synthesize phenylalanine, which is an amino acid, it actually only participates in the last step of the synthesis. So first it goes from, I think this is right, Tremblia to Morinella, back to Tremblia, and then only the last step is completed by the milkweed bug. Yeah, and the other example he gives is that human breast milk has certain sugars that is only digestible by the baby's gut microbes, not digestible by humans at all. So that's produced in order to feed the gut microbes of the baby to help them develop, and then the microbes in turn produce an enzyme that allows the baby to digest. Yeah, and the last one he gives, or outlines, is evolutionary individuality. And I left this one for last because it's like the most controversial as I started reading critiques of Holobiont theory. So Gilbert, Scott, is arguing that the Holobiont is an individual evolutionary unit, and that's the part that's really highly contested. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But it is true, at least in the examples that he gives, that symbionts can provide selectable variation to the Holobiont. And they can do this through affecting reproductive isolation, either by making the cytoplasm of the organism incompatible with certain other organisms, so it can't mate with them and reproduce and evolve. But it also can affect pheromone production in the host, which also affects the way it reproduces with others. Christian.
Did you define symbiont, or did you only define holobiont?
Oh, I can define symbiont. Symbiont is, so for example, if I'm a holobiont of me and my gut bacteria, the gut bacteria is the symbiont, and I'm the host. Yeah. But you could also talk about it as me being the symbiont to the gut bacteria.
Oh,
yeah, so the other part of evolutionary individuality is that, we watched this in the movie last night as well, Lynn Margulis' idea is that multicellular or life at all only exists because of symbiosis between various types of single-celled organisms, where they would eat each other and not digest and just take up their organs for their own personal use. Yeah, and so through these disruptions, Gilbert is like, guess we need a new thing. We need to talk about the Howl of Ion, not just at individual plus other individuals. So yeah, Howl of Ion, like I said, it's you plus your symbionts as a unit. And that has been a big topic of discussion in a lot of types of biology. So this guy, Thomas Pradeu, he wrote the Introduction to Biology and Philosophy in 2016, and he gives a really great summary of some of the things that are agreed on in this discourse and some of the things that are he sees as a problem in the way that it's argued. So these are some things that biologists and philosophers tend to agree on in this discourse. There's question dependence, which is that the answer to what counts as a biological individual depends on what question you're asking. There's a hope or a goal of anti-anthropocentrism, which is that the approach should not be based on human intuition and perception, and that humans should not be the model organism for this. There's hierarchization, which is that individuality is nested and leveled, and that, again, it sort of depends what part of the web you're looking at. There's continuity, which refers to individuality being sort of a spectrum, a continuum, where you can be more or less individuated depending on different things. And transitions, that through different mergers and through things coming together and taking part together, your level of individuality can change. And so these are kind of the things I'm hoping to do when I bring in Delanda to this. And the objections to the way that biological individuality has been discussed is that there's a tendency for monism, which is a focus on a single criterion or a biological field, and it's usually evolutionary biology. Theory centrism, which is a focus on theory-based individuation as opposed to like material examples. There's a tendency for ahistoricity, which is neglecting what people have said about individuality for, centuries. People have been really thinking about this a long time. Disciplinary isolation, which is ignoring other fields like physics and philosophy, metaphysics are things that he specifically references. And conceptual uncertainties, which is that we just don't have a definition of biological individual. So I hope to avoid these things when I bring in Delanda. So the big critique I found of Howl of Ion theory, and I think this does fall prey to a lot of the things Pradeu's critiquing, those are that, so first of all, Douglas and Warren, I don't know anything about them other than this paper. They say that the Howl of Ion is not an evolutionary unit. There are too many factors at play. I don't know the exact mechanisms of it, but they lay out a pretty solid argument that you can't consider it an evolutionary unit. But they say that because of this, you cannot assert that the unit Howl of Ion exists at all, and that it's not a necessary framework whatsoever. In fact, they say that the fields we have, ecology, evolutionary biology, genetics, et cetera, are just sufficient enough to understand biological individuality. So after reading that, I thought I totally wouldn't be swayed. I've been reading Scott Gilbert for a year or whatever, but I read this one argument paper and I was like, oh my god, this is going to ruin my whole project. And so I'm wondering, should I consider myself an individual unit, necessarily existing as one with my symbionts, one unit, me and my symbionts, or should I consider myself and my bacteria distinct units that interact and interplay with each other as like a multiplicity? And I'm thinking about this tension between individual and multiplicity and individual and multiplicity. And I start to remember Delanda. I love Delanda. So it was around the same time last spring, like I said, that I was reading New Philosophy of Society. So I'm questioning this a year later. I'm reminded specifically of the chapter Assemblages Against Totalities. So a brief definition on assemblage. I'll talk about like the actual requirements of an assemblage, but you can imagine visually an assemblage as just like a network, sort of like this. You've got stuff that interacts with other stuff in specific ways, which I'll explain. The first sort of rule, or the biggest, most relevant rule, is the exteriority of relations. So this means that the components that are interacting with each other in an assemblage aren't defined by their relation to the whole. They have autonomous existences that can be plugged into a different assemblage, for example. So the microbes in my gut can be plugged into an assemblage with another species, they could exist in a pond assemblage. They don't have to be in my belly, but there's a certain set of capacities that come to exist through these bacteria existing in my gut, and those specifically are emergent properties. So if plugged in elsewhere, a component of an assemblage will function differently. The example that actually got me to understand this was the human horse gun example. So you can think of the human, the horse, and the gun as all autonomous things exhibiting exteriority of relations when they come into an assemblage together. So they would exhibit different capacities when they're in different assemblages with each other. So for example, the human and the gun can walk and shoot, but it can't go fast. The horse and the human can go fast, but they can't shoot. The horse and the gun can't. I don't know what would happen. Can't shoot without the human, hopefully. So yeah, there are properties of the whole that are not present in the parts alone. Really. Does that make sense? Cool. So yeah, there's a ton of other things about assemblages. There's deterritorialization and territorialization, material and expressive, all these other really important facets, but for this I'm going to focus on this part just because it's like a whole ass book. But the important part about this is that this makes a lot of issues with reductionism really not an issue anymore. And I do this little diagram when I was trying to get my brain to work around this. So macro-reductionism is this tendency to assume that the parts only are what they are in the context of the whole. And that's solved by the relations of exteriority, because actually these components have autonomous existences. And micro-reductionism is the idea that the whole is simply an aggregate of the parts. But that's solved by emergent properties, because there's the whole is sort of more than the sum of its parts. And any part of an assemblage are also assemblages themselves, and they're also necessarily plugged into more assemblages. It's very nested and web-like, as you can imagine. So that means that any part of an assemblage can be micro or macro, depending on what question you're asking. So if you see this little diagram, the assemblage, it's obvious it would be much more web-like with a million other things plugged into it, but for simplicity's sake, you can consider SID plus microbes an assemblage that's also in an assemblage with partners, prebiotics, a million other things. But then you can also zoom in maybe on the microbes and see that they're an assemblage of other types of microbes that came together through evolution, or through assemblage of proteins, things like that. So what does this mean for Holobiont theory? I think taking up the framework of Assemblage theory, the ontology, is that the two sides of the Holobiont debate aren't incompatible. There's scales at which the Holobiont is a necessary framework as a unit, and there's also ways that it must be considered in a more multiplicitous way. And I think this works for Pradeu's issues and non-issues. So I think question dependence, bringing assemblage theory into this, fulfills the requirement of question dependence because it depends which scale of the assemblage you're looking at. It also fulfills hierarchization because also again the scale, and continuity transitions because assemblages can change based on the components that are inserted into them. It also works for anti-anthropocentrism because assemblages are necessarily heterogeneous and have to, you are necessarily involved in relations with non-humans. And I hope at least that this doesn't fall prey to monism, because I think, again, necessarily heterogeneous, necessarily pulling in parts from different fields and different areas, as well as disciplinary isolationism. And I think Delanda emphasizes non-human and human history, so I think it doesn't fall prey to ahistoricity. As for conceptual uncertainty, I don't know if anyone's come up with like a workable definition yet, or if everyone's agreed on that definition, but I hope that maybe using this framework will maybe pave the way to more agreement on what a biological individual is. Yeah, and lastly, it's not like a conclusion per se, more just sort of like a pulling together of disparate parts. But even if there aren't any conclusions, I think that any project that attempts desubjectivization is worthwhile. I think there's something really cool about questioning yourself as an individual. I think there's something cool about acknowledging that things outside of yourself or within yourself have changed you. And I think it's highly political, which again we'll see in Ethan's film. Yeah. Are there questions? It's okay if there aren't. Haley.
This one might be too like falling into like too theory centric or like not material, but like what? So if you think of like say like my relationship with like the chemicals in my brain as an assemblage, like where does like the creation of like abstract feeling come into that assemblage potentially?
Whoa. Can you say more?
So like I don't know, because I think at least the way I'm understanding it, but like also like my understanding like is like very much like a material thing.
Yes.
Or like that like an assemblage is like a physical unit sort of.
There's virtual aspects to it and there's expressive aspects to it, but Delanda's big assertion for the book is that the only thing that exists are assemblages. I didn't want to go out and prove that whole part, but yeah. So it's definitely material, and like I think it would be argued that you do exist. I mean, if everything's an assemblage, then but that is a real thing that exists. For abstract thoughts, would you?
Yeah, just like I don't know, like is that something that can be placed into this assemblage, or is that more of a, like sort of like how we look at that and create a cowboy, and that's like what comes out of it?
I guess it would probably fall into that sort of virtual and expressive realm of things, where an assemblage can sort of be mapped on this vector, and this is deterritorialization and territorialization. This is material versus expressive. And you kind of say like this component is falls somewhere on this spectrum. It's let me see. I think the good example that I found was fingerprints. So there's a material aspect of fingerprints, but without our expressive coding of it, without the way we choose to make that signify something, it doesn't mean anything. It's just skin, right? So abstract thought, I think, maybe plays a role in that assemblage as something more expressive than material. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, and I like this.
Like this.
Yeah.
Thanks. I don't know. Yeah, Christian.
Can you give an example of how the bacteria that lives in your gut exists outside of like animal bodies in the world, and like sort of other assemblages in which it exists?
Megan might know more about this than I do as the resident microbiologist.
I'm not sure I understood exactly what you're asking.
So one of the things that was said was like the bacteria in my gut
Have an autonomous existence.
yes, and can be a part of different assemblages and fulfill different roles within different assemblages. And I was just interested, because I know nothing about the name of the bacteria in my gut, what else it does in the world. Like, what else? What are its hobbies? What else?
So all of the bacteria that exist in you are not unique to you. They exist in the world in other animals or even outside of animals, and they have preferences like anything else. And so your gut serves reproducing outside of your body just fine, and might even find another organism to take residence in.
Okay.
But
I was also thinking about it's not just you and your microbes specifically. There's also like fungal elements in your body, and they exist in like a very complex relationship with each other. So that's another part of the assemblage that they have an existence with fungus outside of us, you know?
and viral, which is even crazier because viruses aren't even considered to be living entities, and yet they play very similar roles as bacteria do, but can't exist outside of a host. So they all have different needs, and but it's all, everything is connected. You are acquiring the bacteria from the external world, so they were living outside of you until you acquired them, and then they started reproducing and building communities. And they keep each other, they have their own checks and balances because they're competing with each other in your gut as well. And that can change if you take antibiotics or probiotics.
At what point are bacteria transferred to like a fetus?
Only during birth
Okay.
or after.
Cool. Interesting.
The amnion breaks. I read.
Yeah, the bacteria didn't get through the amniotic sac, but whether the baby was delivered vaginally or through cesarean, they'll immediately start acquiring bacteria from the environment.
Mine was sort of related that like as I was born through a C-section, was that like would I have benefited from being born vaginally?
I think your microbes can afford you what Delanda says, capacities and limitations. I think so. I mean, there are some people who are like, it's the only way, like your baby, like, and it's sort of similar to like the breastfeeding thing, where like baby's only gonna be healthy if you like breastfeed, like, because the microbes. Yeah, I mean, you're still acquiring bacteria, and it's still helping your immune system develop. But weigh it out, I guess.
Yeah, kind of annoying.
I wouldn't be resentful.
I can add a little bit. It's different bacteria that you acquire when you're born vaginally versus through cesarean. But your body will adjust. The baby, acquires everything it needs in time. But interestingly, now they're starting to do vaginal swabs after birth and then coating the baby afterwards to get the same dose of the same bacteria. My son was born via cesarean as well, and he has a lot of allergies, and I wonder if that had something to do with it. And they are prescribing newborns probiotics now to help with that, but it seems like you turned out fine.
Any last? Oh yeah.
Yeah, this is kind of a complicated question. I guess I've been thinking about a lot lately, but I guess I wonder, and it might also depend on how I'm interpreting a lot of this type of literature and this work, but I guess like especially from a political perspective of some of the implications of the Howl of Ion, especially around more of an emphasis on the cooperative aspects of symbiosis. I guess I'm wondering if there have been accusations towards the Howl of Ion theory on kind of projecting like a kind of almost like moral or hopeful or idealistic framework on these dynamics in nature as being primarily based in this kind of like more interactive or more cooperative way of relating to one another, when there is, in addition to, and maybe underemphasizing the competitive aspects. So I guess I'm kind of wondering about where if that's a concern that people discuss around like this kind of moralistic emphasis on the Howl of Ion relationship as a kind of human imposition in some ways, which is very complicated, but I imagine.
Yeah, so we saw in the film last night, Lynn Margulis, she's sort of preceded this movement, and a lot of the people involved in this take tons of her work. She's an incredible scientist, and in the movie about her last night, we saw just I think an audio clip of her speaking with Richard Dawkins, the like neo-Darwinist, and he was saying like, why do you see the need to like impose this cooperative nature on nature? Like why do you feel the need to like force this on animals when animals are necessarily competitive? And she just said, I think it was really cool. All she said was because it's there. So yeah, I do think. I mean, part of why I got excited about this in the first place was that I thought there were really cool political implications for the idea of biology being a cooperative process, especially when science has been used historically for so long to enforce individualism and competition and capitalism and stuff. But I do think a lot of neo-Darwinist scientists and a lot of traditional maybe scientists take a lot of issue with this theory.
And some of that might be in defense of certain power structures.
Yeah, just like Claire was saying about reifying binaries. Yeah, and this isn't to say that there's no competition anywhere. That's somewhere, I suppose.
Say that like this theory is like more generally accepted. Do you see ways it could like easily be co-opted to just like benefit capitalism anyway?
Yeah, everything is, right? Actually, some of that was the work I was doing last semester with Megan in the slime mold class. So slime mold is like an organism that's really often used for modeling sort of web-like, networky type systems, which for a long time and still is like a really, really cool project, and a really fascinating way of questioning individuality and questioning cooperation and things like that. I guess maybe background slime mold is single-celled protists that come together into a multiple. It's like a thing that has one body and moves as a multicellular organism, but it's still, yeah. So yeah, and then my project last semester was talking about how actually this model is used in like really, really nefarious ways, and it's like I think on the brink of being taken up by some nefarious forces. There was one thing about like Amazon predictive advertising going to use it to model their algorithms, things like that. So yeah, I do think there's maybe inevitably, really sadly, anything that's cool gets stolen by capitalism. And I think things that are really web-like and networky and cooperative work for post-Fordist capitalism with how it's productive. It just does work. I forget what I was going to say. Yes, I do think it will get stolen by capitalism, but I'd like to work with it for now.
Just to respond to my question, I feel as though like something that's happening more recently with like all these social networks is that like sort of all these systems start as like somewhat decentralized, and we think that because they're decentralized, they have like all this like liberatory potential. But sort of what the trend is to sort of capture these this decentralization within a bigger structure, and that's sort of what Amazon does. Is like the free market is like mostly a decentralized idea, and what Amazon does is sort of create a barrier around all of it to like encompass all of it, so that it benefits from all of its movement, and like sort of the same with social networks. In this way that like decentralizing systems generally is always exciting, because we're like, hell yeah, how are you going to tame this thing? Yeah, they generally find a way to.
Yeah.
Like that's just the internet itself.
Right, exactly, yeah. Yeah.
And not to keep plugging the movie, but like that definitely. So when I was doing the slime mold work, what my project ended up being was using black mold to sort of like stop the slime mold from growing in ways. It kind of worked, and it wasn't that precise of an experiment, but I just sort of wanted to play with like how can we like block networks and how can we maybe resist some of this like hyper decentralization and like expansion, like great expansion. And I think sort of that's what we play with in the movie a little bit about like how can we desubjectivize, how can we become this sort of like null body in this web, not one that can be infiltrated, but one that can block these processes, while also embracing the multiplicity of yourself as a mode of desubjectivization. Does that make sense? Yeah.